Hi, welcome to Ancestry Roads. This is Sandy, and today we have a special guest with us. We're going to wrap up our series in coal mining in Appalachia, talking with Wes Addington, the Executive Director and lawyer with the Appalachian Citizens Law Center. We're going to discuss and wrap up a little bit about what black lung benefits are, what's going on with mine safety, just a little bit, and then where do we go from here? So before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about Wes. Wes has been with the ACLC, again, that's the Appalachian Citizens Law Center. It's based in Kentucky for the past 18 years, specializing in federal black lung and mine safety. And I want to also mention that Wes has coal miners in his family. We were talking before the webcast here, and he has a father that was a coal miner for many, many years. And maybe we'll get him to talk to us a little bit about his family as well. Wes represents miners in the fight for black lung benefits and for safe working mining conditions. He is the executive director and a graduate of law from the University of Kentucky. So let's go ahead and introduce Wes into the broadcast. Hi, Wes. How are you today?
I'm doing well.
Thank
nice
you
to be here.
Thank you. I really do appreciate you being here. As we were talking before, this whole series has been very interesting. I started it on a whim. My dad drove the truck for coal mines. Not long, but my grandfather was a coal miner and then carpenter in the coal mines. So it was a whim. It was kind of looking at genealogy and thinking about it. We started with a gentleman who grew up in Itman, West Virginia, in a coal town, a coal company town where they had the company store. Moved on to West Virginia coal miner, a day in the life. Moved on to mountaintop removal. And when we talk about mountaintop removal, then we moved on to what is black lung from a scientific and diagnosis. Those two had a lot of questions for what both of my guests said. Those are lawyer questions. So I appreciate you being here because that's kind of where we're at. Those are lawyer questions. And I know that a lot of people that will watch today live or watch in the future, the questions for some of us that research our ancestry, we don't know who has black lung in our family unless we were told. There's no document that says on the census, hey, this person had black lung. And I've come to find out so many people had questions about black lung, and we're at the point now where we need your help. We need to know a little bit more about how the miners actually get the benefits and what they are, how long they last. I know there's lots of steps they have to go through. Mm-hmm. So before we start with the steps, let me have my producer bring up again. Let's do a short slide on what is black lung. For those of you that missed Dr. McCauley's presentation on the medical insight, the scientific diagnosis of it, it's a miner is going into the mine and they're inhaling the coal dust and it gets into their systems. It's not only just coal miners, even though we are talking about Appalachian coal miners, stonemasons, quarry workers, steel workers can get this as well. There are regulations, and this is Wes, this is going to be a question I know that comes up too. I know there are regulations that each coal mine operator is required to supply a coal miner respirator. And that coal miner cannot go into the mine without that respirator. Is that correct?
Yeah, most underground miners, you'll see in photos of mining that you can Google online, you'll see their self-rescuer there on their hip as they're working.
Now, the question that came up with the diagnosis, what it is, not all miners wear them for the whole shift.
Well, now, so let me clarify. So the self-rescuer, that's what every miner would have on to wear in the case of an emergency. Okay. So let's say there would be an atmosphere that could be extremely dangerous, potentially even fatal to breathe after a mine fire, some sort of other condition that could create that, that's when you would don a self-rescuer. So that's something that would not be opened unless there's an emergency.
Okay.
The other thing that miners really should be wearing is a more traditional respirator. So a device that, you can see them in hardware stores, for example, and there's different levels of the sort of pollutants that they can protect you from. Now, typically in the mining industry, you have to have equipment that's approved specifically for coal mining, because there's always a risk in coal mining of explosion. So, miners, depending on where they're working in the mine, would have to wear equipment that's approved for that location. So, hopefully most miners wear respirators, when they're particularly when they're exposed at the face to a lot of dust. And that's one way to protect them. But that's only, the individual miner being protected from dust. That's not, what is the company doing? Is the company, subjecting them to too much dust in their mining operations? And frankly, if a miner has black lung in the United States, that's a sure indicator that the operations that they work for overexpose them to coal mine dust.
And then that gets into a whole different type of conversation, but similar. Are we providing a safe workplace for them at that point? And no.
Yeah, a safe and healthy workplace, because unfortunately, mining's an ultra hazardous occupation. So you can have a lot of immediate safety risks that could end in serious injuries or fatalities. But then it also, like a lot of other, sort of heavy, potentially dusty occupations, can have long-term, health risks too.
So it's a risk they take. They know they're taking it. Is that kind of the way to explain this? Because as we've talked throughout this entire series, it's putting food on the table and a roof over our head, especially decades ago. This was a very good job.
Yeah, right. And in a lot of communities in Appalachia where we're located, it was the predominant industry. Really, the most males growing up would work in the coal industry in a lot of these communities, and partially because like the place where I grew up, Consolidation Coal Company created it around 1911, 1912 out of sort of a wilderness. So it was a company town. They owned everything. They built the homes. They brought in the labor. Some of it was local labor from Appalachia, but a lot was brought. A lot of miners from Europe, black coal miners from Alabama were brought to these company towns to work. And so I mean, it was the only game in town.
And they also had the forestry. So they were doing the timber, the lumber, they were doing the coal. It was encompassing the entire region. And like you said, that was the only game in town. It's also a generational job. You see a lot of times that a grandfather would be in the coal, then their son, a lot of times their son, depending on the age. I think right now our coal mining is definitely shrunk from, back in the earlier 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Let's just take that range. But we still do have a lot of coal miners out there. And the thing that most people are surprised about is that we should know about black lung. We should know enough to prevent it, but that's not happening, right?
That's right. And one thing, maybe I'll go back really quickly to that you said earlier, talking about when you're doing genealogy and not noticing records of miners having black lung. It was, I know it was a long time ago, but relatively recently, before this country really acknowledged what coal miners were developing in their lungs, and developed a compensation system for it. Because probably a lot of the records that you were looking at was during a time period when the industry was very well funded and funding medical experts to say things like breathing coal dust could actually be good for you. And that there's not, this sort of widespread problem with coal workers developing, any lung disability from their work, which was, clearly just not true, just flat out lies, right?
It's not. And funny, because we also have heard from experts that they also said that smoking helps alleviate some of your pain. So that's why you saw back in the day a lot of coal miners, and this was probably back in the day when there weren't filters on cigarettes either, were smoking. A lot of them had no fear of it. So it was a double whammy, the coal dust, and then chances of getting COPD from tobacco. And again, like you said, just not true, not accurate.
Mm-hmm. And we didn't regulate until, relatively recently, in the last half century or so, the amount of dust that miners would breathe. And so that's why you would have such high rates of black lung among miners, and why so many miners organized themselves to demand, not only compensation for their disease, but protection for future generations.
And actually, it was a gentleman from the unions, I believe. His name escapes me right now. He's the one who actually fought to bring black lung benefits to fruition. And he ended up becoming the labor leader, the president. But it was interesting because one of his comments was, it's not that they're not against this. They're just not for us at all when it comes to black lung. Is that a condition of where the mines were so busy? They were trying to make that money, and they had to keep those ships going all the time in the coal mines to get it out, that they didn't want to stop to fight for black lung benefits, mine safety. There weren't the regulations out there like they are now. And was it more a money game at that point?
Well, I mean, dust exposure for miners has always been, there's always a tension there between the operator and profit. And kind of what I mean by that is, there's been over 100,000 miners killed in coal mines, coal mine disasters, since we've been mining coal in the U.S. That's a lot of Americans have died. And a lot of those have received quite a lot of attention. There's been, frankly, a good response historically in the U.S. for mine safety. I mean, our mine safety laws are fairly robust and protect miners. And so the rate of death in the mines after, making changes at a federal level really declined. And so, we started protecting miners. Unfortunately, with coal dust, although too much coal dust in a mine suspended in the air could be an explosion risk, the bigger risk often for miners is long-term health. Well, for companies, they have to ventilate these mines to prevent that. And that requires a lot of maintenance, that while you're doing it, you're not mining coal. So you can mine a lot of coal in very dusty conditions and it be profitable. And almost, at least our clients here in Appalachia, almost to a person, almost to a miner, they can describe how their particular operation would get around dust regulations.
I believe,
and how they would cheat on dust sampling, how they would try to trick the regulators as to how much dust was actually being produced and miners were being exposed to in their operations, hiding the dust monitoring equipment on themselves, in their lunch pails, in less dusty parts of the mine. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon at all. But, since we've been regulating coal dust in the U.S., companies have been trying to evade a lot of those regulations, because what they require is, as you're progressing in an underground coal mine, every cut that you take and the further you go in, well, that requires some temporary structures in place to divert air and blow it across the mining face and onto the working miners and get sort of that dust and noxious fumes and everything else out of the mine.
Interesting.
So to safely run the mine, you've got to keep up that maintenance.
Yes.
Well, if you're paying miners to do that maintenance when you could have them just mining coal and ignoring the regulations, for the most part, although you increase the risk of your mine blowing up, mines don't blow up that often anymore. They still can and do, but you can make that calculation. And unfortunately, not every company, sort of runs in such an outlaw manner, but way too many of them, still do. And the reason we know that, it's not because the federal regulators have went into the mines and caught every one of them, but we can see the level of disease that a lot of their workers develop
from the miners themselves. You can track their.
That's right.
That black lung, if it's being tracked, where is that data? Would somebody be able to find that data on a government website? Because this is one of the biggest questions that I have for the people who watch my webcast. We do have a lot of genealogists. There is zero way to find that benefit unless you happen to have some old tax records or it comes up. But there's zero way to find that somebody actually died of black lung unless it's on the death certificate. And we found that, again, this is later life. This isn't modern times. It was not put on death certificate. That was the last thing they were going to put on the death certificate. They would put heart attack or natural causes before they would put black lung. So that's tricky. And then I have a second question. If the data is available and you can track it, I guess seeing the miner's health, that's how you're tracking it. Are the coal operators the ones that are doing the testing? Because if they're doing the testing, that's kind of like the fox in the hen house almost.
Yeah, no. So they're not. They're unfortunately for what I think what you're asking. There's data produced by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. So they do surveillance programs, actually, because Appalachia has had such increased level of disease and severity of disease. They have instituted special monitoring. So they literally have a bus that has, they can x-ray miners, they can do pulmonary function testing, and they'll bring it around the region. I mean, they're actually coming through this summer for some testing.
How often do they do that? How often do they try and hit every mine once a year? Or
no? So what they do, particularly with the bus, what they do there is they sort of term these hot spots, places where they're natural data collection. So miners are entitled to free chest X-rays. And so the miners that not every miner participates.
Is that once a year or
typically every 5 years?
Okay.
And so not every miner participates, and there's a lot of reasons for that. That's not just, some miners might not want to know, but there also can be state workers' compensation issues that once you have a positive chest X-ray, then forces you, even if you're not ready to stop working, into making some really hard decisions about your livelihood. But that's a totally different subject. But the NIOSH van will come around, and typically they will go to large operations if the operator. Some operators will invite this. And will allow it, and their miners will go there. Lots of operations, they don't want to participate. And so, typically like here in Appalachia, I mean, they may set up in a place where there's high traffic. So like a Walmart parking lot, for example, and they may be in, let's say, Pikeville, Kentucky for a week. And if enough word gets out, then miners can come through both working, typically this was initially set up for working coal miners because you wanted to monitoring, their current health. But they also wanted to get a sense of just how widespread the increase in black lung had become. And so they opened up the program, and they were doing also retired miners or disabled miners. And they have surveilled a lot of miners, over the past, say, 15 years that they've been doing this.
And they're keeping the data.
They're keeping the data. Now, unfortunately, I think for what you're looking for, it would be nearly impossible to tie that to individuals. You could get the actual numbers and the counties where they're located, and maybe the industry, if they're underground or surface.
But just on a higher level, it's not going to get down to.
Yeah, in the same way with the Department of Labor in the Federal Black Lung Benefits Program, they also track awards. So that obviously would tell you if someone's awarded, then they have black lung, but that wouldn't be necessarily individuals. However, those decisions are public.
That's what I was going to say. If it went to an actual decision or a court of law, that might be the only way. But there's a lot that don't.
Yeah, there's a lot that don't. There's a lot in the federal system that might not necessarily make its way onto the website where it would be easily searched. But there's a fair amount. You'd be surprised, like. Because these are public hearings. People really don't attend the spectators federal black lung hearings. However, because they're public, then that information is kind of public. So, for most coal miners that go through this system and receive a judge's decision, you can kind of actually look up what their condition was, what they were diagnosed with, how severe it was, all those sorts of things. Things that typically might be, privileged medical information are available publicly.
So out of, let's say, 100 cases, how many would go to that type of environment where they would need to fight the decision? Are these people fighting their decision? Or are these people just wanting to be awarded benefits?
So this might be a good spot for me to sort of explain the system. So in the U.S., there's a federal black lung benefits system that applies to any coal miner in the United States. There can also be state workers' compensation systems. Some states, like Kentucky, like West Virginia, like Virginia, can also compensate for developing black lung disease. Now, those benefits would offset with the federal benefits. So someone would not necessarily get additional money per month by receiving both.
So no double dipping at all.
No double.
Would I go to the state first, or would I go to federal first?
Often miners can do both, because there can be situations where it's advantageous to the miner to receive both. Even if, because quite often the federal black lung benefits system, you can think about it like Social Security disability. Either you're eligible or not. If you are eligible, you would receive the same benefit as every other miner in the United States, and it's for life. It's a lifetime benefit. Whereas a state workers' compensation benefit can have, different levels of the benefit that might span a different time period, and quite often would end, much earlier than the miner's life. Sometimes, in severe cases, miners can receive state benefits that are over a lifetime. And sometimes those state benefits would be, greatly in excess of what the federal system is. But, for the most part, a lot of miners, it's advantageous for them to try to receive both.
That's interesting. And they can do it simultaneously.
They can.
And I have another slide that talks about, is this accurate that they receive $737.90 if they have no dependents?
Yeah, I don't have the rate right in front of me, but it's right at that.
So that would be that if they left the coal mine, they were obviously making more than that.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be their limit. If they had dependents, it could go up to as almost 1,500, not quite. If they had, that says with 3 or more dependents. So I can see now why you said some don't want to get tested, don't want to get x-rayed. Because this is a life decision about putting food on the table and a roof over your head.
Yeah. Now, and one other point with state workers' compensation systems, these can vary by state. And so some miners might be eligible for benefits if they can show they have black lung. The federal system is different. You have to have a totally disabling lung impairment.
What does that mean?
That means you could no longer go back and work at your prior coal mining work. So to be eligible for federal benefits, you already would have to be a disabled miner. Your lungs would have to be in such poor condition that you could not return to your prior work. And that disability would have to be at least due in part to your black lung.
So a miner would literally work. You've probably seen this, I should say. A miner would literally work knowing probably they have black lung because there are certain characteristics, the coughing, the hard to breathe, because they needed the money. And then they would work to the end. The coal mine operator is not going to say, "Hey, you got black lung. You might be, really serious here. You need to stop working." They're going to leave that up to the coal miner most of the time.
Like a lot of things, that would vary between the companies. Some companies would see that developing disease is a real financial risk for their company. Other companies, might not be worried about their company in 5 to 10 years and just want the skilled labor.
And that's the other thing that we talked about when we had the West Virginia coal miner talk about a day in their life. It was that skilled labor. You can't just bring a coal miner in, or a person, in from the street and make them a coal miner. There are some things that they need to know and have that expertise. So I'm glad you brought that up because it's not easy to do that. Just say, okay, I'm a coal miner. This one's out. Let me bring somebody in. And is it true that benefits are only available, black lung benefits are only available to miners if they're no longer working in the mine?
Yes, for the most part.
Okay.
There, and I don't want to get into like real legal technicalities here, but there could be situations where a miner has such severe lung disease on his radiology, on his X-ray or his CT scan, that he would be eligible for benefits, and he wouldn't start receiving them, but he could be awarded them, and then the miner would eventually potentially have to make a decision whether to leave the mines and receive that benefit or continue working. But that's a pretty rare situation because that's a situation where the disease is there and obvious, but it hasn't impacted their lungs. They're able to do the exertion still that's required in a mine, but the sort of ominous sign is the disease is there. And that's what's so awful about black lung disease. It's a latent and progressive disease, meaning it may not show up for a while. You may have the exposure today. It might not show up for decades.
Wow.
And it's progressive. So when it does show up, just because you have mild disease doesn't mean in 5 or 10 years you're going to keep that same trajectory. You may think you're a healthy person when you leave mining, and a decade later you're showing signs of serious disease, and then you just decline fairly rapidly.
That's amazing. You've been out of the mines for a decade, and we should also mention there's no cure.
That's right. That's right.
There are some treatments to make it a little easier, but there is no cure for this as well.
And one thing I'll point out from the legal aspect, that one of the benefits are way too low. So that's a totally disabling lung disease. That's what the operator, the responsible operator in these cases, is responsible for paying for their worker getting severe disease, $737 a month.
Yeah.
Now, fortunately, as part of the system, the miner is also entitled to health benefits. And for a lot of our really sick miners, that's way more important than that monthly monetary benefit.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is, I mean, they're going to be in and out of the hospitals a lot in doctor treatments.
And in the more serious cases, and this is something that's happening much, much more frequently, lung transplants are very expensive.
Oh.
And so, we've had we just had 2 of our clients in the last 6 months at Vanderbilt having lung transplants. Now, fortunately, they're both doing pretty well. It's a very extreme procedure. Heart transplants are a lot more common in this country. The outlook on someone who receives a heart transplant, or other transplants, liver transplants, for example, lungs are much trickier, and the recovery on those and the body's ability to accept those new lungs and the long-term outlook are challenging for miners. So it's a really risky procedure. However, a lot of miners get to the point that that's their only hope.
That's right. Well, I'm kind of happily amazed that they are allowing this, because my brother actually had a liver transplant at Vanderbilt many years ago, and has documented and talked about it. And he got it because he had a tattoo back in the day. They didn't have the safety requirements. They didn't clean them properly. And at first he was going to be denied because that was a recreational type of thing that he decided to do. And those regulations, and who decides the transplants is a whole different topic. So I'm pleasantly amazed and surprised that they're allowing the coal miners to come in and get these transplants, because I can see them saying there's other reasons why your health is bad because of the coal dust. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm just really still kind of shocked over that. And
yeah, I mean, one of the fortunate parts of the federal black lung benefits system is once you're entitled to benefits, it is difficult for companies to challenge every little prescription or every little medical procedure for your lung treatment. So, the federal system doesn't really allow you to constantly relitigate. They can't lose the case and then say, well, I don't think that particular breathing treatment is appropriate for your black lung. It's really for something else. They really have to have pretty concrete reasons to do that, which is fortunate. One other thing quickly, what we've been talking about for the most part, and is what you would consider medical pneumoconiosis. So if you go to medical school, you're the way you're taught what is co-workers pneumoconiosis. Fortunately, in the federal system, we also have a concept what's called legal pneumoconiosis. So medical pneumoconiosis is when you're diagnosed with the traditional form of the disease on an X-ray or on a CT scan, or unfortunately, if it's by biopsy or autopsy. But what we know is coal dust can cause other lung problems that the general population also gets. So emphysema, COPD, chronic bronchitis, those sorts of things. And a miner can have totally disabling emphysema or COPD or chronic bronchitis, and not great evidence of the medical or clinical pneumoconiosis, and still be entitled to benefits. So essentially, like any dust that you breathe in a coal mine, if it causes you to develop a disabling lung impairment, then that can be compensated by the federal system. And that's an important, that that's something that's changed over time. Because it used to be that these companies would claim, well, these other things, maybe some smoking or some other
activities outside that coal mine.
That's what's causing your emphysema. Or we've had physicians claim, oh, it's the part of the country you live. People are generally just more exposed in their everyday lives, and that's what's causing it, not your 35 years in an underground coal mine. And so it's harder for them to make those sorts of arguments now than it was, 30, 40 years ago.
So let's then talk about, I guess the next phase is, I have black lung. Maybe I went to the bus and x-ray. They say I have black lung. I know I have black lung. I'm coughing and things like that. So the procedures. How do I go from having no benefits to applying for benefits?
Okay. So let's start with the example you just gave of the working miner. So the working miner has some protections under the law to protect themselves. And if I make the mistake of saying him, I am not excluding women coal miners. It's just such a predominant part of the industry. And frankly, women miners were the last to be hired and the first to be fired. And because of that sort of atmosphere, most women miners, for the most part, weren't as exposed and fortunately didn't develop the level of disease. Although we have had a few women miners with black lung and entitled to benefits. But so if you're a working miner and you develop black lung, you have a right under federal law to transfer to a less dusty area of the mine. And the company can no longer work you at the mine face in heavy dust. Like they lose the right to direct you to certain locations in the mine, and you're tested by the federal agency. It's the idea is, let's say, just because a miner, even though it's a latent and progressive disease, just because a miner develops black lung and is still working, that doesn't mean that they have to die from the disease. But if they continue to work in really heavily dusty conditions, that's a much increased risk of that happening. And so the theory is, why don't we bring them out into either fresh air or air that's mostly dust free, and allow them to work in positions, with the mining company in that situation. The other thing that provision of the law does, and this is key because this is a choice that the miner has to make whether to exercise this right, is they can't cut his pay.
I was going to move my next question. Okay, so what's the pay drop? So interesting.
Right. So, we were talking about skilled workers. Well, a continuous miner operator, the miner that's literally cutting the coal, can be one of the highest paid positions in the mine, because the better that person is at taking the machine exactly where it needs to be and cutting straight and getting, the most coal you can and the least amount of everything else, the more money the company makes. So that's a skilled position.
Yeah.
If you're a really good miner operator, you're a commodity, you're really sought after. But you're also more likely to develop serious disease because you're right there, breathing, a lot of the coal dust. And so, because you make more, if you elect to transfer, it would, to a position that's, say, outside or maybe not as skilled, you're probably going to be looking at a pay cut, in a normal situation. Fortunately, under federal law, you're protected with that provision.
That is very interesting to me. I would assume that would have went the other way and the paycheck would have decreased.
Right. And so the other thing too is a company cannot discriminate against a miner for having black lung. And so they can't. They can't find out that you've got black lung and then say you're fired.
You're out. Yeah.
Right. That their miners are protected in those situations too.
So the company's insurance rates must be outrageous. Just for health insurance for their workers must be outrageous. We always hear that from employers, how the insurance rates, are based on the occupation, the rate.
Yeah. I mean, when so many miners have died in coal mines and developed such serious disease, that's not surprising that insurers would take that into account when they're now unfortunately, one of the things that employers can do, and particularly larger employers will use this in the federal system, is they can self-insure. They don't have to go buy third-party insurance. So like in the federal system, you do have to have insurance against black lung. So just like, we have to buy liability car insurance, companies have to insure themselves, but they don't have to go out and go to Travelers Insurance and buy that policy. They can tell the government, we'll cover it.
Yeah, but that's a tricky slope, because the next thing you know, they go bankrupt.
That's right. And if the government hasn't made sure that this company has set aside enough money to cover their future potential liabilities, they go bankrupt, and then it falls on the disability trust fund, the federal fund, essentially the taxpayers, to cover those benefits.
Okay, so let's go back. So I get an X-ray. Do I have to go to their? I know back in the day I had to go to their doctor. Nowadays, I do not.
So the way the federal system works is you file a claim, and one of the great things about the federal system is that entitles you to a free exam. You get a free chest X-ray, you get a free pulmonary function test, you get a free arterial blood gas test, and then you also get a reasoned medical opinion from a doctor regarding what all of those tests show, and do you have black lung? Do you have a pulmonary disability? And if you have both, is black lung causing, a significant part of that disability, or a substantial part of that disability? And so that's a great part of the system. And the way it works is, depending on which state you live in, you're entitled. There are providers that the federal government keeps a list of that have agreed to participate in this program. And you're entitled to pick a doctor off of the list in your state or any state that touches your state.
Oh, okay.
So if you're a Kentucky miner, you can go to a Virginia doctor on that list.
And if you're bordering that state, so you're closer to that doctor. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, we're a border county here with Virginia, so just across the mountain, there's a black lung clinic that does federal black lung exams, and so miners could choose to go there.
Now, how long does it take if a doctor certifies it and I put in my paperwork? How long does it take to actually see benefits?
So if you're one of those cases that the federal disability trust fund covers, let's say your company self-insured and went bankrupt 10 years ago, if you get that initial exam and that, doctor says you're totally disabled due to black lung, you may see benefits within a year or so. It takes a little bit of time, it could be quicker, but it takes a little bit of time to process the paperwork, set up the visit, go to the visit, get the report back. Then the Department of Labor, reads the report and then makes a determination. So, you could be looking at a year or so.
And I'm not working.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Now, that's the rosy scenario. That's the scenario where
it's not very rosy, but okay. Well, I'm scared to see what you say next.
Yeah, but that's the scenario where the government is the only entity involved in this process. In the vast majority of these situations, you also have a responsible operator that's been identified as responsible in the event that the miner's entitled to benefits. They have the right to send you to their doctors and have you evaluated. And even if the initial determination by the Department of Labor is that you're entitled to benefits, they have a right to ask for a hearing before an administrative law judge. If they lose the case before the administrative law judge, they have a right to an appeal to the Benefits Review Board of the Department of Labor. if they lose that appeal, they have a right to appeal to a federal circuit court of appeals, which is the courts, the next step below the U.S. Supreme Court. And then in theory, they could go to the U.S. Supreme Court, but that's not going to happen. But they do sometimes appeal to the U.S. circuit courts.
And how long is this track?
That depends. For the most part, a lot of our cases will take many, many years.
You're killing my producer. He's like, he's shaking his head. He's on, because he comes from coal miners too.
So yeah, and so
we're not working. We're trying to get benefits to. This is.
And I'm going to give you the more extremes, and these are not super uncommon. I mean, they don't happen in every case, but I took on a case right after I started at ACLC that ended 15 years later.
Oh.
I represented the miner's wife, a good 9 or 10 years after he passed away due to his black lung. And so many of our clients' cases don't get resolved before they die, and often their spouses are left to seek,
well, this brings up a good question from a viewer. Then there's perfect timing. How long does black lung benefits last after a miner's death? So if they have children, do the children get it like Social Security benefits?
So the way it works is the miner can receive benefits while they're living. The miner's benefits would end after their death. However, and one of the components of a change in the law under the Affordable Care Act that sort of restored some of the things that were in the law in the early days is that widows or survivors, most often it's widows, sometimes it's widowers, are entitled to automatic benefits if the miner had won their case. So then the benefits would continue for the spouse for their lifetime.
For their lifetime.
And it's the same rate. It's just obviously a change in dependence. So a miner and their spouse would receive the initial benefit plus a dependent. When the miner passes, it would become a survivor's claim, and that survivor would just receive the single award.
Would they get back benefits, or just from the starting point of after going through all those legal cases?
Yeah, so I'll try not to be too confusing here, but quite often what happens in our cases where miners pass away while their claim is pending is we will litigate both the miner's claim and the survivor's claim at the same time.
Okay.
And so then the survivor would be entitled from benefits from the time they filed the claim or from the time the miner died. And the miner's claim may be entitled to benefits way back before that. Either typically it's when they file the claim, but if you can show when they actually became disabled due to the disease, you can get it before the time of filing. So if you have really good evidence that the miner was sick with black lung 5 years before he filed his claim, you may be able to get additional benefits back to that point. So that, although, and unfortunately, the way the system works, there are some incentives here for companies to do these very long appeal process. And that's because they typically will not initiate benefits until the case is over. The government will step in and start paying monthly benefits while the case progresses from the trust fund. They don't pay the back pay. So if the miner, is entitled to 4 or 5 years of back pay, that's just sort of sitting out there until the case is over. And then when the case is over and the miner or the surviving spouse has won, the government will kind of do an accounting, and they'll say, hey, responsible operator, you owe the miner this much money, and you owe us this much money because we've been paying the miner or paying his spouse during this litigation. And then they have to essentially pay up at that point.
So this tells me that coal is still extremely profitable if they are able to not only make a profit, but pay back large amounts of money. And I know that they're bringing equipment in. I guess the most profitable would be also mountaintop. Do you see a lot of coal miners with black lung with mountaintop, or is that going to be more silica?
No, you can get the same types of disease both underground and surface.
Okay.
And I mean, there's studies about, surface miners developing very severe disease because, those miners can work in sort of sunken pit areas that, you just think about airflow. I mean, it's just like anything else. Ventilation can solve a lot of problems, but if the company's not worried about making sure that the miner, like let's say the miners, we'll get miners who work in equipment that have cabs that close, but yet they develop black lung. And then you learn in their cases that the company wouldn't repair the air conditioning. So their choice was to either work the equipment with the doors open, or you can imagine, 130, 140 degree temperatures inside an enclosed cab with no air conditioning in the middle of summer.
And that brings us to another question, Nick had. You're hitting all of Nick's questions because this is very similar. With our previous webcast with Dr. McCauley, he said a lot of times the coal miners will not wear their respirators because it's hot, it's sticky, it's annoying, and a lot of times they will take them off. So I know Nick saw the previous one because he was asking questions. So I guess this is where he's asking this. If they take the respirator off, does the coal company know or document it, I guess, and disqualify them for benefits? Because like you said, if I'm in a cab and it's summer and it's, all glass, it's heating me up. I got to open the windows. So the same thing, I guess, with the respirator. If it's dusty, it's wet, it gets clogged at times, I got to take it off to breathe. So
it does not disqualify them, and I can explain a couple reasons why, and also some other things about respirators. So federal law is structured so that a miner could work their entire career, and not with or without the use of a respirator, but work their entire career without ever developing black lung disease. And I mean, I don't mean like disabling black lung, I mean any black lung disease. We know how to do that in the United States. All you do is you ventilate the areas where your employees work. If you don't do that, they're at risk of developing disease. So that's one point. The other about respirators is, unfortunately, what we've learned is a number of the manufacturers of those respirators, it's been proven through very extensive litigation all around the country that a lot of those manufacturers knew that their products didn't do what they claimed that they would do to protect miners. So you have miners that would wear respirators religiously and still develop very severe black lung disease. And there was internal documents from some of these companies showing that they knew that it didn't provide the level of protection that they were claiming it did, and they just continued to sell them.
Unimaginable.
So the only surefire way to prevent the disease is, not placing workers in very dusty conditions. And we can do that in the United States. We know how to do it. Lots of other places mine coal and don't see the level of disease. Lots of places in the United States mine coal and don't see the level of disease that we see in Central Appalachia. And that
is so disheartening. That is like, and this is where it kills me. This is why this webcast is a webcast, is because of the way Appalachians are thought of and treated. You're killing me right now with this. But you're right. I know in England they have better practices for their coal miners. It was kind of a national outrage when they found out in Australia that some of the miners that they thought they had essentially eradicated black lung completely in the industry, and they found out they hadn't. And the level of disease we're talking about there is some of the lowest levels of disease, and it was an outrage. And we're just continuing with having large cases of severe black lung here in Appalachia.
And the thing is, we have here in Central Appalachia, we have a higher percentage of minors developing the most severe form of the disease than we did when we first started monitoring this in the early 70s. And those miners in the early 70s had worked with no dust regulation.
Yeah, they
could have
hardcore. These guys went in on their knees and they were breathing that dust. The machines weren't with the water, weren't tampering it down.
And now the levels are higher. And so there's reasons for that. And we can get into it. But one thing I wanted to follow back, because I didn't answer your question about children.
Yeah.
And children benefits, if your children can, as a dependent, can receive benefits, as part of a claim. If you're an adult disabled child, you can receive benefits on the minor's claim.
Okay.
If you're an adult disabled child that was disabled before age 22 and continued that disability, you can receive benefits as a survivor, much like a spouse would.
Okay.
So those are the only two situations. But like most children are not entitled to any benefit once the minor and the minor's spouse
passes away. I'm still in shock. You've got me still in shock of a couple things here. I'm pleasantly surprised that a coal miner's salary is not going to go down, federally regulated, if they have black lung and move to a different part of the mine. But at the same time, I am just unbelievably shocked that even in the US, we have mines that have solved the mystery of trying to keep black lung from their workers. But in Central Appalachia, we are seeing an increase in numbers of severe black lung. And it's just astounding to me that this is happening. I did not expect that.
Yeah, I'm not going to sit here and say coal companies are doing a good job around the country. They're not doing a good job. It's just the companies here in this region are doing, you could pick a number of different adjectives.
Yeah, I'm thinking of them.
And I'm not sure that I could really, sort of convey the disgust that people in this country should have as the way we treat our coal miners in Central Appalachia, and sort of the horrible conditions they have to work in. And then, and I don't want to get too, morbid on this, but just sort of the horrible deaths that they die because of this disease.
It is a terrible death.
They just suffocate more and more, a little more each day, a little more each day, a little more each day, until they expire.
And I will say that's pretty much the way my grandfather went. And he was a smoker because he was told to smoke. And he was told that it would help alleviate something. Probably he just felt like it was something to do. And that's the way you explain it is exactly the way that it happened. I just really thought, truly, when I invited you on to the webcast, I thought you're going to tell me things like, well, I'm going to be out of business soon. But no, you're not.
If you had told me when I first started at ACLC that we would see miners this sick, I would have said no.
You'd say no way,
because there's no historical evidence that would show me that there's something coming like what we're seeing now. Because when I first started, we rarely had a miner with what's called progressive massive fibrosis or complicated pneumoconiosis. So those are the larger areas of black lung on your lungs. Rarely. And often, even if we would get a positive chest x-ray that would show that, future ones would say, no, we actually misdiagnosed it. It's not as serious as we thought. Now, it's very common to see that in our cases. And often the companies sort of handpick physicians see the same things, and we often use their own evidence against them because the miners are so sick. We're getting miners now that have what's called category C complicated pneumoconiosis. That means a third of their lung is just basically one large nodule of pneumoconiosis, of black lung. And your outlook in those situations is so poor. And your prognosis is very poor.
So the ACLC, you come in and try to help the miners as well. Now I know that we had originally thought we'd be able to talk a lot about mine safety, but we're going to have a separate conversation about that because black lung has been so important. But when you not only help the miners with black lung, you help them through the process, but you do also help with mine safety. I guess the question I have, if you're seeing a lot more black lung now, then you probably have a pretty good idea which coal mine operators these are coming from. And how do you or does ACLC, is there any way to help this at that level of fixing the problem at that level so future coal miners don't come out of that same mine with these level Cs?
Yeah. So what I would say to that is you can identify some of the worst operators, but frankly, a lot of companies, even some of the companies that are better on other safety issues that don't have a lot of fatal accidents, that don't have a lot of serious, sort of maiming type accidents, a lot of them can be kind of terrible on dust. Because, like I said, it takes maintenance and it takes time and it takes effort, and you can make a lot of money mining coal instead of hanging curtains. So, but the one thing that can be done, and the thing that we've been pushing for for more than a decade now here at ACLC, is we don't have a separate silica regulation. So we limit and we've reduced and we've, asked that this be done, and it was done under the Obama administration, how much coal dust that miners breathe. So that's been cut by 25%. We asked that it be cut by 50% because NIOSH told us that was the level to eradicate black lung in 1996. Well, at that same time, they also talked about, the danger of silica dust. And because all of the good coal seams are gone and these companies are having to mine a lot of rock alongside the coal that they're mining just because of the conditions, miners are, silica, I've seen some medical literature that would basically say it's about 20 times more deadly than coal dust. And so you really want to limit silica. Unfortunately, in this country, we don't have good regulations on silica. And that's something that we've been pushing for a long time. There's going to be a proposed rule.
Do you think we'll get there at all?
There's going to be a proposed rule. And this has been in the works in the Biden administration. Whether they can get it across the finish line is the question. And that's something that we, as an advocacy group too, not just a legal organization, but, because what I'd love in life is to not ever have to litigate another black lung case. I'd love us to get to the point, and that doesn't mean that the coal industry goes away. That just means that the industry as it exists stops making our miners sick, and that we have to find something else to do with their time. And we're hopeful that if there's a strong silica regulation, at least the miners working today and future miners won't be put in the kind of conditions that their parents or grandparents had to endure. Time will tell, but we'll know that in the coming months. We're getting closer and closer to the rule being published, the proposed rule, and then hopefully getting to a final rule. But just like anything else with agency rulemaking, that's a difficult process. But, we have a lot of people that are trying to hold regulators' feet to the fire about getting this done.
Is there anything that we can do as, having ancestors, some that do watch our webcasts are coal miners, some have coal miners in their family. Is there anything that we can do? Is this a letter writing campaign, a call your congressman, your senator campaign type of thing?
Yes, it can be exactly that sort of thing. And we do policy work here too. We have a director of policy. I will get with her and we'll figure out the best way to utilize your audience if they're interested in supporting that. because we don't have a proposed rule quite yet, so we got to see what's in it. You know, I mean, there's a chance that we get it, and I don't think it's sufficient, and then we've got an issue.
Okay.
But if it's a strong rule, it's something that we want to, you know, sort of as American citizens, support this getting finalized, so we can reduce the amount of silica that miners are exposed to.
And will you post information and updates on your website for that?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the website is here. It's up on the webcast now. So definitely, I would like everybody that's watching this now, live or in the future, to click on their website and keep watch of the website, because I will tell you, silica really scares me. Coal dust, it scares me very much because I've seen it. I've seen the effects of it. Silica is a whole different animal here, and it's not something you really want to mess with, and it's not something you want to die of.
No, it's not. And, you know, my grandparents and great-grandparents worked in mines, and the seams that they were working in were so large, you didn't have to cut rock, you just cut coal all day. And that's not the case for current miners. And so that's why it's so important that we reduce how much of that silica dust that they have to breathe.
I would agree with that. Well, I know that we're going to talk about mine safety, but Wes has shared with us before the webcast that another colleague of yours, I might be able to convince, come on and talk a little bit about mine safety and also environmental risk as well. And ACLC is also working with environmental risk. You also work a little bit with reclaimed mines, and we can discuss that in future webcasts as well. I got to tell you, I'm shocked at some of the conversation today. I really thought you would come in and say, Sandy, I'm almost out of business. We're going to eradicate this. We're going to solve this, but it's really disheartening to hear that in Central Appalachia, as you mentioned, you're seeing worse cases than ever before.
This was probably 15 years ago, 13, 14 years ago. We were doing some planning in our organization, and the topic came up, like, once, you know, we see these black lung cases decline, what areas should our organization focus on? And if you told me then that we'd be doing as much work as we're doing now, it would have been, it's disheartening. It really is, but it's necessary work in the people with the disease and their families, particularly, because it's, you know, obviously it's a horrible condition to have, but it's also horrible for all of the families to watch their loved ones sort of go through this process. So, you know, it's really important to try to prevent it in the future, and then make sure people are, you know, not only compensated, but, you know, their health is cared for while they're dealing with it.
That's a big thing too. Like you mentioned, the healthcare alone is expensive, and they need that. They really do need that. So I would say everybody watching, definitely check out their website. They're fighting the good fight here for our Appalachian coal miners. And I appreciate you coming on the webcast and sharing this, because this is kind of the end of our coal mining in Appalachia series. As I mentioned, a lot of the questions that we're talking about today came up from viewers and also guests along the way of this series. I would just like to, I guess, end this webcast as well as saying that with the ACLC and them fighting the good fight, they're bringing in some hope for some of these families, but also working with the federal government as an advocacy. We still need to remember, at the heart of this, we're talking about individuals and people, and these coal miners are making the decision to go into the mine, whether it's, you know, the mountaintop or if it's underground. This is a way that they are feeding their families. And without coal miners, we wouldn't have a lot of the energy that we have today. Not really going to talk about environmental at this point. That's a topic for another day. But I do want to say that without these coal miners putting their lives at risk, we wouldn't have a lot of what we have today. And guess what? A lot of that coal came from Appalachia. So I just want to say that as we listen to all the series and we find out more information about these coal miners and what they go through, from living and growing up into a small coal mining town, working a coal mine, working the mountaintops, and then now black lung and silica damage, we do owe them some appreciation for simple things. You know, there's steel that's made out of this coal. There's electricity that we're getting. So I think a debt is owed to these coal miners as we try and help them. And I appreciate an organization like ACLC that's there for them. They're put in their job, they put in their work. And when it's pretty scary, I imagine, with the disease that they have at advanced stage, I appreciate an organization like yours that's there to lend them a hand.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's a lot of the modern conveniences that we have today is because of all the coal that's been mined in this country. And unfortunately, there's been a lot of toll on bodies and families, and particularly in Appalachia, to get us to where we are. And so I agree with you. There are some fairness issues there, some justice issues that need to be acknowledged and addressed. And, you know, this is just one minor way, just this federal black lung benefit system. It's the least that the United States could do for the coal miners.
I couldn't say it better. I think you're right. And for those of you that are watching that are not in America, we continue to still hope to change the narrative on Appalachia here with this web series. That's the whole reason why this webcast even began. So I hope you do also take away appreciation of our Appalachian coal miners. I know I have coal miners watching in other countries, and not to discount you either, because I know you gave a lot and continue to give a lot to your own country. So a salute to the coal miners out there. And thank you, Wes. I appreciate you joining. And
it was wonderful to be here.
We will see everybody next time. And we're going to get the ACLC back for an environmental talk as well. So thank you, everybody.